right, everybody, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen so we can work on this next part. All right, so we're going to talk real quick about some other commodifications of sex in that industry. So you're going to have things like brokering marriages in the industry, which includes internet sites, catalogs, and companies which work in the industry of commercial spouses. This can leave you're going to be your mail order brides. This is going to be your paid for international spouses. And this can leave women in those particular situations incredibly vulnerable to violence and social due to the social isolation, possibly language isolation. And it can leave people inherently. There has to be an incredibly careful amount of vetting in that some of those sources lie about the ages of the women, in which case they end up trafficking minors. And so there can be some really gray and sometimes very, very icky areas within that environment. Sex tourism, which is traveling to a foreign country with the intent to engage in sexual activities with a sex worker. In many countries, sex work is legal. And so there is a booming industry for sex work in which specific places in the Nordic regions, say Amsterdam, say places in Brazil, Vietnam, some of these places have a very high amount of sex work, and they create essentially a business around and a tourism around the sex work. Usually it's businessmen or wealthy men from wealthy countries that are engaging in these endeavors and these kinds of travel. And again, there's some links to racism, colonialism, and impoverished area. Take Vietnam, for example. A lot of the reason they became a sex tourism kind of place and within their capital is due to the fact that during the Vietnam War, a lot of women were trafficked and or became sex workers to provide services to U.S. servicemen. And as that destabilization of that country happened due to those wars, they ended up with an environment that was ripe for sex tourism and ended up in a ways that limited the ability for those sex workers to manage their own brothels, their own, I guess, inclusion in that trade. And so those ideas that colonialism leaves its traces and that war leaves its traces and can leave very limited opportunities for work for women that create dynamics where this kind of work increases. You also have romance tourism, which is traveling to engage in limited romantic interactions. And this is primarily by women. So these are going to be your single lady cruises. These are going to be your going to, like, there's certain islands and certain places you can go to where essentially you have your cabana boys or what have you that are primarily geared towards single women who want to have very limited time engaged in romanticized interactions. And again, having conversations surrounding this idea of how we're gendering these notions. So there's not a big difference between sex tourism and romance tourism, except for the gender in which they tend to appeal to. And the way we talk about this is that, again, women are looking for these little love trysts, whereas men are looking for sex. When in actuality, there's not a whole lot of difference between these two particular things. And again, there is still links to racism, colonialism, and the impoverished areas that create these dynamics. So now we're going to kind of get into human trafficking. I will let you know that Summer Dickinson, who is an activist outside of Louisville, and she works in doing a predominant amount of work in Kentucky and in the Kentucky region in order to create safe places and create homes for those who have been trafficked as a way to get on their feet and a way to kind of re-engage within community in safe and protected ways. So distinctly, human trafficking is distinctly different from sex work because it is in no way, shape, or form consensual. It is coercive, it is slavery, and it is usually created and surrounding intense amount of harms and violence towards oneself that keeps someone stuck in those patterns. It's a transnational organized crime industry, and there is an unfortunate massive amount of growing in this industry. Primarily women are trafficked. Roughly 20% of those are underage. It's primarily women of color and from impoverished areas. So when you see a lot of those campaigns that have those poor young white women on the front cover, that is predominantly not how human trafficking works. It is usually the vulnerability. It's usually, it's overwhelmingly your homeless youth. It's overwhelmingly your LGBTQ plus youth and women of color. There are three different specific sections of human trafficking. There's the recruitment, there is transport of human trafficking, and there's exploitation of those who have been humanly trafficked. Some are sold by family in impoverished countries because of falsified ideas of immigration. So this will give your young person a better life, and that is not just in sex trafficking, but that can also be in labor trafficking. I'm going to send my son away to this other country to get this job that's going to pay well enough that he's going to be able to get by on his own or come back and help us. When generally what happens is that those individuals end up sold into some kind of slavery and or debt bondage, which we'll get into in just a second. There is also members that are sold by their family due to large amounts of family debt, and those people coming and claiming their debt ownership of the children. Again, so we're going to talk about consent. Consent is this the idea that when a person agrees to engage in a sexual act with another person without force, and I added without force, coercion, or lack of alternative choice. Again, consent can get kind of tricky because because on one hand, we want to believe that everyone has the choice to consent. That is not always the case. On another hand, we also want to be very careful in saying that no sex worker has the ability to consent because all of it is coercive, because then we are not allowing those voices that are saying that it is consensual to speak for themselves. And while that may not be maintained throughout their life course, and they may not agree with that as they have or seek alternative options of employment, that is still up for them to decide. And as long as it is not being coerced into it, and as long as that person can speak for themselves legally, then we need to give them the right to express themselves in whatever way and engage in the line of work that they believe is acceptable. Also, again, this becomes really difficult, especially when it's talking about legalities and who is considered an adult. So you can technically get married as young as 12 in the United States in some states. And for most people, we would consider that sex slavery. We would consider that, again, marrying a minor. And there is not always an age gap rule, meaning that it can be a very much an older man that essentially marries a very young girl. That is not considered human trafficking as long as someone consents. Unfortunately, when it comes to those specific marriages, those things are consented by by a legal adult that is responsible for them, not always a parent, but their legal caregiver can sign those papers as early, again, as 12 in some states. These things can also create situations that are, again, non-consensual, and until they get to a specific age, they are not of legal, they do not have the legal ramifications to get out of said marriage and or to oppose it. So there's a lot of very interesting dynamics there, and if you want to go down a really depressing rabbit hole. There's a lot of information that you can garner on the legal, the legalities that create space for and continue to create space for child marriages in this country, not just in other countries. And then the legal implications of drawing the lines between social circumstances and coercion. So again, when you have a very limited or lack of any alternative solution for, like think of maybe an immigrant that has come into the country without the proper legal channels. They're going to have limited forms of income that they can have. And so if this is the only form, do we consider that coercion? Do we consider that not? How do we really define that and or differentiate that? And it can get very tricky. Risk factors for being trafficked. Homelessness is a very, very, very big one. 1 in 5 youth who are homeless have become a victim of sex or labor trafficking, or both. Lacking economic security, substance abuse, lacking of social support, and or being kicked out of your house because you are LGBTQ+, lacking age to get jobs legally. So those under the age of 15 and or without work visas would fall under this category as well. LGBTQIA, lacking other options, again, linked to increased homelessness, lack of social supports, family displacements, and an increased risk of harm from reporting measures or resources. So again, there are a lot of housing shelters for youth, but those housing shelters don't always have space and or allow LGBTQ+ persons, and especially trans persons, within those shelters. And if you don't have a place in a shelter, then you are limited on your ability to go places. Also, there's an increased limit to your employment as a LGBTQ+ member. And because of that, you are going to create economic circumstances where there are limited opportunities, which creates a risk factor for being trafficked. So your immigration status, as we talked about several times, if you're fleeing from domestic violence or war violence, and you're put in a very precarious situation, you can end up in the hands of traffickers. A lack of jobs in your in your home region can leave you in the international human trafficking network. A promise of economic or immigration outcomes, promises of other jobs once you arrive, debt bondage. So essentially saying, hey, the trip here got here, the trip to get you here cost you this much and you have to work it off. That can end up having people trafficked and is illegal. And or there are language and cultural boundaries, barriers that keep you from getting any kind of other outcome. Just some graphics. At the bottom, the 20 million people that are victims of forced labor per region of the earth. Note that that is not just sex trafficking, but that is also labor trafficking, and that is actually far more of the trafficking victims that we have. Again, so some of your social, community, relationship, and individual risk factors are on that middle graphic as well. So war and military and sex modification. During every war that has been in the history of war, there has been sexual violence as part of their military tactics. This is not something that necessarily is outrightly spoken anymore, because it is now considered a war crime, but that didn't happen, I don't think, until the 80s. But it has a long history of, again, conquest, colonialism, and war, because it was considered something that you could do to humiliate your the other faction that you were warring, by sexually exploiting their women and or what have you. Again, this places women in a point of dehumanization and an object to be harmed in order to gain superior status. And so we need to, again, think about the ways in which war creates a dynamic for women that, again, objectifies them in ways that is inappropriate and downright wrong. Sexual exploitation in war-torn areas, again, with limited economic choices, leaves And again, I'll go back to that area of Vietnam, but this again happened in the Middle East more recently, and continues to happen in places where we have military factions. Sex tourism is also linked to military members. It's considered part of morale building. Sexism and sexual benefits, sexism, and it's considered a sexual benefit to servicemen. And there is a lot of sexual tourism that is wrapped around or surrounding military base locations. It is actually one of the factors, again, that has been proven to be part of why certain places are geared towards specific things for military. So if you're geared towards bases that are respite places or more for combat ready locations, depending on what that base is there for, you're going to see more sexual tourism around it. Military and the marriage of immigrants. So again, this can be very consensual and can just be a case of I fell in love with somebody who is a different culture than me, but it can also be a situation where the women are lacking alternatives and or have questionable connections to trafficking networks. And again, this has been something that over a historical period of time has been consistently seen. Again, so this is the end of our modification of sex lecture, but I wanted to make sure that you have resources available to you. So these are here. If you need them, please access them. Do not hesitate to reach out if you need anything or just need some support or an ear to talk to. I will remind you that I am a mandated reporter. However, I can point you in the right directions. All right. I hope you all are having a good week. And again, take care of yourself as we work through some incredibly challenging material.